G'day, tribe. It's a beautiful day, and I want to shout out a couple of men, Peter Scandera and David, or Dave maybe, and Peter Scandera. Couple of Kiwi boys from the North Island, and it's a song they got called Fishin' Blues, which was written by Henry Thomas. Henry Thomas in 1911. So we'll roll with that. We'll get it going. And I've got something special to show you. Henry Lawson 50-cent pieces, mate. Scored them today. Can't wait to get into it. And I might do a quick noodle. See how we go. We're going to start with a 1977 Annie Colleen coin. Silver Jubilee. And if it's not a Silver Jubilee, if it's a kangaroo and an emu, it's worth over 10 grand. So we'll see.
Your sweet wife is gonna catch more fish than you. Many fish bites if you got good bait. Here's a little tip that I would like to relate. Many fish bites if you got good bait. I'm a going fishing, yes, I'm going fishing, and my baby gonna fishing too. My baby brother bought me right out of my mind. So can I go fishing with you? I take him all down to the Waikato River. What do you think that little rascal might do? He's got a 9-pound catfish from the bottom, yes he caught him. Laughed and he hollered, he was high as a kite. The big one bites if you got good bait. I'm a going fishing, yes I'm going fishing, and my baby going fishing too. Mama put it in a pan, mama cook it till it's nice and brown. Put some chili hot sauce on it, cook it right up and you chop it right down. Say many fish bites if you got good bait. Here's a little tip that I would like to relate. Many fish bites if you got good bait. I'm a going fishing, yes I'm going fishing, and my baby gonna fishing too. Let's get that guitar now. Fishing all of the time, my baby gonna fishing too. Bet your life, your sweet wife is gonna catch more fish than you. Many fish bites if you got good bait. Here's a little tip that I would like to relate. Many fish bites if you got good bait. I'm a going fishing, yes I'm going fishing, and my baby gonna fishing too.
Very cool tune. Very cool tune. Thanks, man. Thanks, gentlemen. What I do want to show right now, I'm excited about this. I got this today. The Henry Lawson Treasured Australian Stories. It was a bugger to open. I already opened it. Check this out. These are aluminium bronze $half. Check this out. See if I can get a light right. How's that? Very nice. I haven't had a good look at him yet. 2022, 50 cent uncirculated. Is that aluminium, bronze or metal? ALBR, I presume so. 40,000. Well, there you go. That's one of them. I'll show me favourite one last. This is a great story. The Drover's Wife. If you look it up, if you never heard it, she is one tough, strong person. Oh, another dog in there. Very cool. Very cool. This was the last one they had at where I get me coins from. They always keep them for Anna, thankfully. Oh, I better show you the other side. Just the Lizard Queen. What's that finish? Oh, that's on the... Is that on the bloody coin? No, it's on the plastic, I think. Yeah, it's on the plastic. Yeah, very cool. The last one I want to show you is the Loaded Dog. The Loaded Dog is funny. If you can find it in a song or in a poem, you'll get a great laugh. Look at it, young pup with a bloody bomb in its mouth. Stick of dynamite or something. Everyone's running, the whole town's running. It's a funny story. It's a funny story. Yeah, very cool. Same thing, 40,000. Very cool. Very cool. All right. What we going to do next? May as well have a noodle. May as well. I'll put that up. Oh, if you're wondering what's going on with the propeller, the boat motor prop, I'll tell you at the end. It's a bit of a story. All right, let's get into it. I've got to share this with you. A quote from Henry Lawson. I'm at home and at ease on a track that I know not, and restless and lost on a road that I know. Henry Lawson. Great poet, writer, just brilliant. And to save you the troubles of looking up the Loaded Dog, I found it. Let's roll. Might do a noodle. See how we go. The tribe is strong. This is Dobby Newton and the Bushwhackers.
The Loaded Dog. Dave Regan, Jim Bentley and Andy Page were sinking a shaft at Stony Creek in search of a rich gold quartz reef which was supposed to exist in the vicinity. There is always a rich reef supposed to exist in the vicinity. The only questions are whether it's 10 feet or hundreds beneath the surface and in which direction. They'd struck some pretty solid rock, also water which kept them bailing. They used the old-fashioned blasting powder and time fuse. They'd make a sausage or cartridge of blasting powder in a skin of strong calico or canvas, the mouth sewn and bound round the end of the fuse. They dip the cartridge in melted tallow to make it watertight, get the drill hole as dry as possible, drop in the cartridge with some dry dust and wad and ram with stiff clay and broken brick. Then they'd light the fuse and get out of the hole and wait. The result was usually an ugly pothole in the bottom of the shaft and half a barrow load of broken rock. There was plenty of fish in the creek, freshwater bream, cod, catfish and tailors. The party were fond of fish, and Dave and Andy of fishing. Andy would fish for 3 hours at a stretch if encouraged by a nibble or a bite, now and then, say once in 20 minutes. The butcher was always willing to give meat in exchange for fish when they caught more than they could eat. But now it was winter, and these fish wouldn't bite. However,
The creek was low, just a chain of muddy water holes, from the hole with a few bucketfuls in it to the sizable pond with an average depth of 5 or 7 feet, and they could get fish by bailing out the smaller holes or muddying up the waters in the larger ones till the fish rose to the surface. There was the catfish, with spikes growing out of the sides of its head, and if you got pricked, you'd know it, as Dave said. Andy took off his boots, tucked up his trousers, and went into a hole one day to stir up the mud with his feet, and he knew it. Dave scooped one out with his hand and got pricked, and he knew it too. His arm swelled and the pain throbbed up into his shoulder and down into his stomach too, he said, like a toothache he'd had once, and kept him awake for 2 nights. Only the toothache pain, he said, had a bird edge. Dave got an idea. Why not blow the fish up in the big water hole with a cartridge? I'll try it. He thought the thing out, and Andy Page worked it out. Andy usually put Dave's theories into practice, if they were practicable, or bore the blame for the failure and the chafing of his mates if they weren't. He made a cartridge about 3 times the size of those they used in the Rock. Jim Bentley said it was big enough to blow the bottom out of the river. The inner skin was of stout calico. Andy stuck the end of a 6-foot piece of fuse well down in the powder and bound the mouth of the bag firmly to it with whipcord. The idea was to sink the cartridge in the water with the open end of the fuse attached to a float on the surface, ready for lighting. Andy dipped the cartridge in melted beeswax to make it watertight. We'll have to leave it some time before we light it, said Dave, to give the fish time to get over their scare when we put it in and come nosing around again, so we'll want it well watertight. Round the cartridge, Andy, at Dave's suggestion, bound a strip of sail canvas that they used to make water bags to increase the force of the explosion, and round that he pasted layers of stiff brown paper on the plan of the sort of fireworks we called gun crackers. He let the paper dry in the sun. Then he sewed 2 thicknesses of canvas over it and bound the thing from end to end with stout fishing line. Dave's schemes were elaborate, and he often worked his intentions out to nothing. The cartridge was rigid and solid enough now, a formidable bomb. But Andy and Dave wanted to be sure. Andy sewed on another layer of canvas, dipped the cartridge in melted tallow, twisted a length of fencing wire round it as an afterthought, dipped it in tallow again and stood it carefully against a tent peg, where he'd know where to find it, and wound the fuse loosely round it. Then he went to the campfire to try some potatoes which were boiling in their jackets in a billy, and to see about frying some chops for dinner. Dave and Jim were at work in the claim that morning. Now, they had a big black young retriever dog, or rather an overgrown pup, a big foolish 4-footed mate who was always slobbering around them and lashing their legs with his heavy tail that swung round like a stock whip. Most of his head was usually a red, idiotic, slobbering grin of appreciation of his own silliness. He seemed to take life, the world, his 2-legged mates and his own instinct as a huge joke. He'd retrieve anything. He carted back most of the camp rubbish that Andy threw away. He used to retrieve them, even when they went swimming. He'd jump in after them and take their hands at his mouth and try to swim out with them and scratch their naked body with his paws. They loved him for his good-heartedness and his foolishness, but when they wished to enjoy a swim, they had to tie him up in camp. He watched Andy with great interest all the morning making the cartridge, and hindered him considerably, trying to help. But about noon he went off to the claim to see how Dave and Jim were getting on, and to come home with them for dinner. Andy saw them coming, and put a pan full of mutton chops on the fire. Andy was cooked today. Dave and Jim stood with their backs to the fire, as bushmen do in all weathers, waiting till dinner should be ready. The retriever went nosing around after something he seemed to have missed. Andy's brain was still working on the cartridge. His eye was caught by the glare of an empty kerosene tin lying in the bushes, and it struck him that it wouldn't be a bad idea to sink the cartridge packed with clay, sand or stones in the tin to increase the force of the explosion. He was turning to suggest this to Dave when Dave glanced over his shoulder to see how the chops were doing and bolted. He explained afterwards that he thought he heard the pan splutter an extra and looked to see if the chops were burning. Jim Bentley looked behind him and bolted after Dave. Andy stood stock still, staring after him. "Run, Andy, run!" they shouted back at him. "Run! Look behind you, you fool!" Andy turned slowly and looked, and there, close behind him, was the retriever, with the cartridge in his mouth, wedged into his broadest and silliest grin. And that wasn't all. The dog had come round the fire to Andy, and the loose end of the fuse had trailed and waggled over the burning sticks into the blaze. Andy had slit and nicked the firing end of the fuse well, and now it was hissing and spitting properly. Andy's legs started with a jolt. His legs started before his brain did, and he made after Dave and Jim, and the dog followed Andy. Dave and Jim were good runners, Jim the best, for a short distance. Andy was slow and heavy, but he had the strength and the wind that could last. The dog capered around him, delighted as a dog could be to find his mates, as he thought, on for a frolic. Dave and Jim kept shouting back, "Don't follow us! Don't follow us!" But Andy kept on, no matter how they dodged. They could never explain, any more than the dog, why they followed each other. But so they ran. Dave keeping in Jim's tracks in all its turnings, Andy after Dave, and the dog circling round Andy, the live fuse swishing in all directions and hissing and spluttering and stinking. Dave shouting to Andy to go in another direction, to spread out, and Andy roaring at the dog to go home. Then Andy's brain began to work, stimulated by the crisis. He tried to get a running kick at the dog, but the dog dodged. He snatched up sticks and stones and threw them at the dog and ran on again. The retriever saw that he'd made a mistake about Andy and left him and bounded after Dave. Dave, who had the presence of mind to think that the fuse's time wasn't up yet, made a dive and a grab for the dog, caught him by the tail, and as he swung round, snatched the cartridge out of his mouth and flung it as far as he could. The dog immediately bounded after it and retrieved it. Dave roared and cursed at the dog who, seeing that Dave was offended, left him and went after Jim, who was well ahead. Jim swung to a sapling and went up it like a native bear. It was a young sapling, and Jim couldn't safely get more than 10 or 12 feet from the ground. The dog laid the cartridge as carefully as if it were a kitten at the foot of the sapling, and capered and leapt and whooped joyously around under Jim. The big pup reckoned that this was part of the lark. He was all right now. It was Jim who was on for a spree. The fuse sounded as if it were going a mile a minute. Jim tried to climb higher and the sapling bent and cracked. Jim fell on his feet and ran. The dog swooped on the cartridge and followed. It all took but a very few moments. Jim ran to a digger's hole about 10 feet deep, dropped down into it, landing on soft mud, and was safe. The dog grinned sardonically down on him over the edge for a moment, as if he thought it would be a good lark to drop the cartridge down on Jim. "Go away, Tommy," said Jim feebly. "Go away." The dog bounded off after Dave, who was the only one in sight now. There was a small hotel or shanty on the creek, on the main road not far from the claim. Dave was desperate. The time flew much faster in his stimulated imagination than it did in reality, so he made for the shanty. There were several casual bushmen on the veranda and in the bar. Dave rushed into the bar, banging the door behind him. "Me dog," he gasped, in reply to the astonished stares of the publican. "The bloody retriever, he's got a live cartridge in his mouth." The retriever, finding the front door shut against him, had bounded around and in the back way, and now stood smiling in the doorway leading from the passage, the cartridge still in his mouth and the fuse still spluttering. They burst out of the bar. Tommy bounded first after one and then after another, for, being a young dog, he tried to make friends with everybody. The bushmen ran around corners and some shut themselves in the stable. There was a new weatherboard and corrugated iron kitchen and wash house on piles in the backyard, with some women washing clothes inside. Dave and the publican bundled in there and shut the door, the publican cursing Dave and calling him a crimson fool in hurried tones and wanting to know what the hell he came in here for. The retriever went in under the kitchen amongst the piles, but, luckily for those inside, there was a vicious yellow mongrel cattle dog sulking and nursing his nastiness under there. A sneaking, fighting, thieving canine whom neighbours had tried for years to shoot or poison. Tommy saw his danger. He'd had experiences with this dog and started out across the yard, still sticking to the cartridge. Halfway across the yard, the yellow dog caught him and nipped him. Tommy dropped the cartridge, gave one terrified yelp and took to the bush. The yellow dog followed him to the fence and then ran back to see what he'd dropped. Nearly a dozen other dogs came from round all corners and under the buildings. Spidery, thievish, cold-blooded kangaroo dogs, mongrel sheep and cattle dogs, vicious black and yellow dogs that slip after you in the dark, nip your heels and vanish without explaining, and yapping, yelping small fry. They kept at a respectable distance around the nasty yellow dog, for it was dangerous to go near him when he thought he'd found something which might be good for a dog or cat. He sniffed at the cartridge twice and was just taking a third cautious sniff when it was very good blasting powder, a new brand that Dave had recently got up from Sydney, and the cartridge had been excellently and well made. Bushmen say that kitchen jumped off its piles and on again. When the smoke and dust cleared away, the remains of the nasty yellow dog were lying against the paling fence of the yard, looking as if he'd been kicked into a fire by a horse, afterwards rolled in the dust under a barrow, and finally thrown against the fence from a distance. Several saddle horses, which had been hanging up round the veranda, were galloping wildly down the road in clouds of dust, with broken bridle reins flying, and from a circle round the outskirts, from every point of the compass in the scrub, came the yelping of dogs. 2 of them went home, to the place where they'd been born, 30 miles away, and reached it the same night, and stayed there. It was not till towards the evening that the rest came back cautiously to make inquiries. One was trying to walk on 2 legs, and most of them looked more or less singed, and a little singed, stumpy-tailed dog, who'd been in the habit of hopping the back half of him along on 1 leg, had reason to be glad that he'd saved up the other leg all those years, for he needed it now. There was one one-eyed old cattle dog round that shanty for years afterwards who couldn't stand the smell of a gun being cleaned. He it was who'd taken an interest, second only to that of the yellow dog, in the cartridge. Bushman said it was amusing to slip up on his blind side and stick a dirty ramrod under his nose. He wouldn't wait to bring his solitary eye to bear. He'd take to the bush and stay out all night. For half an hour or so after the explosion, there were several bushmen round behind the stable who crouched doubled up against the wall or rolled gently on the dust, trying to laugh without shrieking. There were 2 white women in hysterics in the house, and the publican was holding his wife tight and begging her between her squawks to "Hold up for my sake, Mary, or I'll lamb the life out of you." Dave decided to apologise later on, when things had settled down a bit, and went back to camp. And the dog that had done it all, Tommy, the great idiotic mongrel retriever, came slobbering around Dave and lashing his legs with his tail and trotted home after him, smiling his broadest, longest and reddest smile of amiability, and apparently satisfied for one afternoon with the fun he'd had. Andy chained the dog up securely and cooked some more chops while Dave went to help Jim out of the hole. And most of this is why for years afterwards, lanky, easy-going bushmen riding lazily past Dave's camp would cry in a lazy drawl and with just a hint of a nasal twang, "Hello, Dave. How's the fishing getting on, Dave?"
Well, there you go. There you go. Henry Lawson is a great writer and storyteller. God bless him. And this is the song about it, guys.
Henry Lawson told a story, so to him it does belong. But I wrapped a tune around it for to tell it in a song. It's a tale about three bushmen prospecting for gold, and the saga of the loaded dog, as Henry Lawson told. They had heard about a reef of gold out near Stony Creek, and so they sank a shot and struck hard rock at 7 feet. They had pitched a tent and made their camp in a patch of scrub, and Dave and Jim were down the shot while Andy cooked some grub. They drilled the rock and blasted it, progress was hard and slow. Still they persisted with the patience gold prospectors know. Dave Regan, he loved fishing, and Andy Page did too. But now that it was winter, they were catching very few. So Dave suggested they blow up the big hole down the creek and trade what fish they didn't want to the butcher for some beef. So Andy cooked some spuds for lunch and put the billy on, and while the chops were frying, started making up a bomb. With miners blasting powder wrapped up in calico, then tightly rolled in sailcloth with whipcord then besewed. A 6-foot fuse inserted with the end split for the light. The bomb was dipped in tallow then to make it watertight. They had a big retriever pup with a permanent foolish grin, and no matter what they threw away, he'd fetch it back again. He watched where Andy hid the bomb away from everyone, and when Dave and Jim came up for lunch, the dog began his fun. He had the cartridge in his mouth as round the fire he came. The fuse began to hiss and spit when the end fell in the flame. Well, the three men bolted different ways through the bracken fern, while Tommy thought it was a game and chased each one in turn. Jim shinned up a sapling, Tommy waited underneath, a silly grin across his face with the bomb between his teeth. The fuse was getting shorter, so Jim sprang from the tree and bolted for the pup while Tommy chased him playfully. He charged into the barroom and quickly slammed the door. When Tommy couldn't get inside, he went under the floor. A savage yellow cattle dog was waiting underneath. He wanted what that big pup had, it might be good to eat. The cattle dog, he chased him out and bit him really hard. So Tommy dropped the cartridge there in the hotel yard. The yellow dog stood over it, sniffed it up and down. Then suddenly the bomb went off and rocked that little town. Some saddle horses broke their reins and galloped down the street, and pieces of that cattle dog were blown 500 feet. Well, Dave and Jim and Andy went quietly to their tent, while Tommy grinned his broadest grin, pleased with the day's event. What could have been disaster in the pub at Stony Creek turned out to be a thing the bush folk laughed about for weeks. And travellers heard the story, and the story got around, the story of a loaded dog that terrorized the town.
Yeehaw! Alright, couple of quick things to do. We'll check out and see if that 77's a Silver Jubilee or a dinner plate, the emu and kangaroo, because we eat our coat of arms in Australia. They made them into a bag of chips one day. It was cool. They won. They won the competition. Let's check it out. All right, where are we? Upside down. Here we go. I'll put the rest down. I won't do a full noodle. I've got to wind it up. Thanks for hanging around, tribe. It's great to catch up. And quickly after I show this, I'll tell you about the boat propeller just quickly. 1977. Let's have a look. Ah, goodness. It's not. It might be silver though. They made 7,000 silver ones of these. So when I work out how to tell silver properly, I'll check them out. Cool. All right, and the boat prop. The boat prop, excuse me, Hazza. The boat prop, crikey. That's what it's supposed to sort of look like. Bit of a god douche. We were flying. We were doing about, I don't know, 30 knots or something. And we cut a corner a bit too sharp. And it just went freaking boom. It's like far out, man. What the hell? We cut the corner too short. It was low tide and bloody, we did the gearbox too, but it's all fixed, sorted. That happened a while ago. Yeah, so don't cut the corner too short. Go and flat knacker after 40 hours of fishing. All right, guys, have a beautiful day. Wishing you all a peaceful, beautiful day. And thanks, Henry. I'll read his quote again. I'm at home and at ease on the track that I know not, and restless and lost on the road that I know. Henry Lawson. What a legend. Peace out, tribe. It's wishing you a beautiful day. And if you're travelling, take care. Take care. Good dish. The tribe is strong. Good dish.